I'm Dr. Susan Thistlethwaite, a senior fellow here at the Center for American Progress, and currently I work with the National Security Team. I'm also a professor of theology at Chicago Theological Seminary. I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Tariq Ramadan and also talking about our schedule this afternoon and our distinguished panel. Brian Katulis, senior fellow here at the Center for American Progress in National Security. Hussein Ibish, senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine and executive director of the Hala Salam Maqsood Foundation for Arab American Leadership Discussion. Our able moderator is Matthew Duss, policy analyst at CAP and director of Middle East Progress. We're here today to consider what the popular uprisings in the Middle East mean for the future of political Islam, to ask what role Islamist political parties play and will play in countries that are opening up through democratic reform, and what the implications are for U.S. foreign policy in the region. Our main speaker, Professor Tariq Ramadan, brings a valuable perspective to these questions. I have known Professor Ramadan for nearly a decade. He and I, along with about a dozen others, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, formed the Abrahamic Dialogue Group at the United States Institute of Peace in 2002, and we had many meetings. This was organized by David Smock, and it was completely closed door, but it was really open mind. Perhaps the best way for you to get to know Professor Ramadan is through his own words in his book, What I Believe. I am Swiss by nationality, Egyptian by memory, Muslim by religion, European by culture, universalistic by principle, Moroccan and Mauritanian by adoption. This self-introduction contains what I think is the fundamental thread that runs through his work. He believes, again quoting from the same volume, our identities are multiple and constantly on the move. In other words, human identity is not fixed and static. In a globalized and increasingly networked world, identity is dynamic, and that includes religious identity. Such an approach resists the thesis that there are fixed and intractable civilizational identities that are opposed. Such a view leads to what Edward Said called a clash of ignorance, a quotation Ramadan uses in his 2010 book, The Quest for Meaning. Professor Ramadan is widely regarded, as he himself says, as a controversial intellectual. So when you clear away the brush of the outright misquotations, the exaggerations, and the general churning of the blogosphere, what remains that could be called controversial? I think it is his ideas on pluralism and identity. Professor Ramadan, in my view, does not seek an imagined middle between two imaginary poles. Rather, as I read his work, he's a philosopher of pluralism who is Muslim. Pluralism itself is often misunderstood as relativism. This is not how Ramadan defines it or uses the concept. What he means by pluralism is found in the self-introduction that I just read. Identity is not cast in stone in modern culture. It is plural. It is dynamic. This is challenging to the self, to the other, and it creates tension as well as opportunity. But why, in effect, would this be controversial? Let me illustrate this question by quoting from something Professor Ramadan asked me when we met again after several years at a dinner party in Chicago at the home of mutual friends. We had not seen each other in several years, and he didn't say, hello, Susan. He walks up to me and he said, at our last meeting at the U.S. Institute of Peace, you said a quotation and I need the reference. As though we had simply left the room for tea 8 years ago and had just come back. What's the quotation? I ask. I don't want my difference to be respected. I want it to bother you. Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, I said, wrote that. Dynamic pluralism is transformative. It asks something of you and of everyone in a culture, a religion, among religions, among cultures, and among societies. It is not easy. Such dynamism can and does produce great reactivity and vigorous efforts to secure a fixed identity. We are witnessing this tremendously dynamic moment in the Middle East in 2001, and the question, what does this mean, is the question of Dr. Ramadan. He will address, and our panel will discuss with him. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susan, for this invitation first and for this introduction to this discussion about what is happening and in which way we can try to get a sense of what is happening in the Middle East, in North African countries, and also, of course, thinking about political Islam and in which way things are changing and moving. You have been quoting many things about the work that I'm doing in, not only in the West, in fact, is crossing the board in Muslim-majority countries as well as in the West, where I think we have to get to a sense which is part of what I want to say here. At the end of the day, some of the questions that we have to do with us being consistent with the values that we are preaching. We speak about democracy, we speak about pluralism, we speak about respecting the choices of the people. There is something which is going to be critical. Are we heading towards true, transparent democracies, or are we heading towards something which is unknown so far in the Middle East and in Muslim-majority countries? While from the very beginning and for years, all these countries that where uprisings are happening, have been banned from every one of this country. Libya, 18 years, Syria, 17 years, 18 years in Tunisia, and 16 years in Egypt, where I haven't been able to go. Because exactly for that point, I was critical towards these regimes and saying that they are dictatorships and unacceptable as the way they were dealing with oppositions and torturing them and radicalizing, in fact, a segment of the opposition. So, as we only have 20 minutes as an introduction to our discussion, let me just raise some points that I think are important to at least highlight and understand. Very often when we speak about what is happening in the uprisings, we are very much discussing the economic dimension, the political dimension with democracy and people being against dictatorships, and all this is fine. I really think that there is one dimension that should be put into the picture here, which is the economic dimension, on at least two levels. We all said, and myself was surprised when it started in Tunisia. I didn't expect anything like this to happen in Tunisia, even after Mohammed Bouazizi self-immolated himself. I think, okay, that's very, very strange that it has been, it is happening so fast, so quickly with people and mass protests like this. And when I was asked at that very moment, do you think that it's going to have a domino impact? I said, no, I don't think that it could happen in Egypt. While I was saying that the ingredients are all there, exactly the same, but I don't see Egypt going the same way. And they proved me wrong by protesting and being also in a very fast mode, following the footsteps of the Tunisian people. While there is one dimension which is important, is that if you look at what was happening within the country, and analysis talking about this, is the economic situation, poverty, marginalization within the society was a very important factor. That the bread prices increasing and people not being able to survive. What I got from Egypt, for example, people telling me the situation, the economic situation for the poor people is very bad. So we were talking from a political dimension. I think that we really have to look at the factors, the economic factors that are helping us to understand that at one point people were getting to a limit, saying it's enough, we can't cope with these regimes. So, and this is why it took like this mass protest and people being able to come crossing the board from any political background and religious background, because this was also the case in Egypt. Now, also something which is important at a macro level dimension in the economic field is that in the region, in North African countries as well as in the Middle East, and this is also something which helps to understand the shift in the position of the United States in the region, is new players and actors in the region that were very important. China is known, but it's important to reassess our understanding of the Chinese presence in the Middle East, in the North Africa. If you go to Africa today, if you don't get a sense that what the Chinese presence is doing and changing, it's just tremendous, tremendous. So there is also something which is, we know now from Gamal Mubarak's son. He was starting to get, economic relationship with China, which were worrying for some of the actors. So the transnational corporations are not far from considering also this dimension. I'm not saying that they are controlling, but there was a shift in the new players. Coming from South American country, listen and just try to get also a sense of the new relationship between someone like Chavez and many of the countries there. So think we need a South-South relationship. Resistance. So the economic factor when it comes to the macro dimension, and he was ready to play with the Islamists. Many South American governments today are dealing with. You know what happened also with Lula going to Iran, with Turkey, and saying we are ready. We are ready to try to find a solution not to go to a clash. So having a complete new understanding of what political Islam could mean in the region. So I think that this is also a factor when it comes to economic relationships that we have to keep in mind, and not only being obsessed with the democratic processes on the political side, but also the new relationships on the economic side. And knowing that we are not only dealing with the US government or the Egyptian government or Mubarak, we're also dealing with economic multinationals and transnational corporations that have a say on the whole process. And I would say that today it's something that we have to consider. But it's not in our discussion very often when it comes to this. Having said that now, let me come to what we can see and in which way this is interesting for us. Beyond the economic reasons we have, and it's quite clear, political reasons, and the first is to try to understand what happened and the strength of these movements and at the same time the weaknesses of these movements. The strength that we have, it's quite clearly that mass protests with people coming from all the sectors and all the political backgrounds, from the leftists to the Islamists, coming together beyond and being young people using, that's clear, the social network. And by the way, once again, we have to reassess all the speeches and the analysis that we have. Oh, it came all of a sudden. That's not true. 2 years before Tunisia uprising, the people were trained to mobilize the people, bloggers, 2 years before, 3 years in Egypt. And they decided that we are going to go in the footsteps of what is happening in Tunisia. The policemen, they decided this. This was a political decision, and with also a clear discourse. No slogans against the West, no slogans against Israel, and it's against the dictators and the regimes. This was a decision by people trained by using the means. And they were trained in many other countries, in Serbia, in Russia, here in the States, and they were very much involved in the whole process. I'm not saying that they were controlling, but they were pushing in a direction, knowing what should be said and what shouldn't be said. In Tahrir Square, the Liberation Square in Egypt, someone started to shout against Israel. He was shut up and said, "Don't say this. This is not the business here. Our business is Mubarak. We are not going to speak against Israel." So there was something which was quite interesting, and the strength was clear slogan, non-violent resistance, pacifist on the ground, and once again, what was good, it was the American advice to the armies, and it started in Tunisia. We got this from the French, who were quite interestingly silent in the whole process at the beginning. France, which was supporting for so long the Tunisian regime, being completely out of the picture. And the first to react was the President Barack Obama, paying tribute to the people and helping to the process to get rid of Ben Ali. The decision to have him in Riyadh was taken here. So this is something that was acknowledged afterward by the French, and we got the answer here that this, of course, was a support to the people against the dictator and against the Tunisian dictatorship. Having said that, they were trained, so the starting point was not predictable, but the means were managed. They were trained to do so. And I think that this was where the youth and the young people were very powerful, doing and succeeding where all the political parties and even the Islamists were not able to do this. They were out of the picture. In Tunisia as well as in Egypt, they were not leading. And this is something which was important, no charismatic leader. And what, for example, was said first and quite quickly by the Israeli government, it's going to be like Iran. It was quite clear what is not. It was not, and it is not what was happening in the 90s in Iran with the charismatic leadership of the Ayatollah Khomeini. But the weakness, and the weaknesses that we are witnessing now, is that no dialogue between the opposition force, not able to tell us and to tell the people not only what we don't want, but what we want as the future of the country. The civil society and the political forces, this is the weakness of the whole movement. And everywhere, when we today are told that in Tunisia you have more than 40 parties, this is not the real democratic process. 40 parties is just scattering the whole process. Is that what is going to happen with this? Every single, intellectuals or political force coming and saying and creating a party, it doesn't mean that we are going towards a democratic process. And the people are still wondering who is leading, who is behind the scene. Do we have people? Is it going to be a transparent process? In Tunisia, which is in fact ahead of what is happening in Egypt, it's a question. In Egypt, you have seen this last Friday, people in the street saying, we don't want the regime, or people behind the regime controlling everything, and they were targeting, of course, the army. And the army is still there. So many people, many actors there are saying the problem is that we don't have opposition forces talking to each other. It's quite weak. The civil society is weak. And all this business about the constitution can be a very important challenge, but it's not the main one. The constitution is the framework within which all this is going to happen, but the main one is really for these parties to go towards a true democratic process. In 6 months, it's difficult. So even the next election are not going to be the final point. It can be a step. Which kind of step? This is important. So I think that from a political viewpoint, what we see is this still very weak coming from within the society, that we cannot, and this is what I have been saying, the people there cannot blame the West for controlling. They also have to be critical about the fact that they are not getting any platform where it's quite clear that these opposition forces accepting the democratic rules are going to come together and to get it. I think that we have also to be quite clear on this. This is at least the assessment that I have been getting with all the studies of the region now. Now, having said that, 3 things that I wanted to highlight as important points. There is something which is quite clear, that for years, what was sold to us, and we bought it very quickly by the dictators, is better us than radical Islamists. And before 11 September 2001, it's a very long process. I heard this very long time ago, where it's better dealing with dictators. They are getting security, stability, and protecting our geostrategic interest than radical Islamists. And I don't buy anything which has to do with the West saying, we don't know who are these Islamists. That's not true. So the British, the French, and the American, they know exactly who they are dealing or not dealing with. And sometimes we are very quick to deal with some Islamists and not with others, depending on our interests. But the point is here that they were not leading these movements. They were trying to find a place. It was true in Tunisia. They were not leading. They were just caught by surprise. They were trying to find a place. And exactly the same in Egypt. The first attitude of the Muslim Brotherhood, which were portrayed as the radical Islamists in Egypt, if you study them, you just cannot just bear this. This is not the right assessment. But what was said is they will be the opposition, the most or the best organized opposition force. What they did is just to put themselves behind al-Baradei. Baradei was saying, he's the guy, he's the one that we are. And very quickly, they just understood that he's not going to be the guy because he's not known by the people in Egypt. He's coming as an alien actor, not him. So they choose the wrong one. They chose the wrong one. And then they are trying now to be involved. It doesn't mean that they are not going to play a role. They are going to play a role in the future if we go towards a transparent democratic process. Now we have to ask ourselves how and which kind of questions we need to ask here, because they have something which is a historical credential as an opposition force to the regimes, and this is known. Now, the point is that what was sold by the government was to say, better us than the other, and we have been in the West. The American administrations, the following American administrations and European countries supporting these dictators for decades because they were saying better us than others. And at the same time, it's good. I like the fact that the people were saying, we are not going to speak against the West, we are going to speak against our dictators and our dictatorship. It's a national issue. But still, we also have to understand that at the end of the day, anything which is going to happen towards something which is a democratic process will come back to us. Are we serious and consistent with our values? Because we can't just support dictators, work for peace and stability and security, understand that these dictators are putting in jail, torturing people, and in fact, the best way to radicalize the people is to torture them and to put them in jail. If you want a democratic process, you don't go for that. So we are inconsistent in the way we support, and at the same time, we preach for peaceful democratic processes. So it's good that they are not criticizing the West, but it's good for the West to be self-critical in the way we have to deal with this. And it means that if we are serious about democracy, we need to take a stand on political Islam. We need to take a stand. To demonize all the political Islamic trends is not going to work because they are not all following Al-Qaeda. By the way, Al-Qaeda is a minority trend in anything which has to do with political Islam. Very often rejected by all the other political Islamic trends. So we have to understand the diversity. So as we have a diversity in our identity, as there is a diversity of Muslims within Islam, there is a diversity of Islamists within Islamism. And we have to get that as something which is important. So, so this binary vision, it's either or, the radicals or the dictators. I think we have to get rid of this and to understand that what happened there was really a new message coming from the Muslim majority countries in North Africa and the MENA region, North Africa and the Middle East. And we have to get to understand what is happening. On that point, two things should be said. First, if you look at, for example, Ghannouchi in Tunisia. Ghannouchi in Tunisia was the first to speak about democracy from an Islamic viewpoint, saying, I don't have a problem with democracy. He was criticized by other Islamists, saying, what are you talking about? Our concept is shura. And he said, no, democracy, I don't have a problem. The principles of democracy are ours. He was criticized, and now he's coming back saying, we are ready to work with other parties, and we are going to accept the rule of law. So someone like him, who's coming back, he has a historical credential and credibility within the people. And if we want to go for a democratic process in Tunisia, how are we going to get them within the picture? And this is the point that I'd also have in Egypt. If you just go through the last 20 years of the Nahda, the Tunisian group, you will find that they are evolving, changing, reconsidering the way they deal with the West, the way they deal with the civil society. Even some of them in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Egypt now, in Jordan, for example, being able to say, our relationship with the concept of Sharia is that we accept al-Dawla al-Madaniyya. Al-Dawla al-Madaniyya means the civil government. And in anyone who is studying political sciences, it means separation of authority. But they are not using the concept of secularism and secular. And we need to understand, to have an intellectual empathy in the way we use our words. Because what secular means in the West is not what secular means in the Muslim majority countries. It's, the connotation is very negative. Why? Because it came with colonialism there, and it came without democracy. So the democratic process which came through the secular process in the history of the United States of America, in Europe, is exactly the opposite. We get separation between state and church for the state to control religion and then to repress the people. So it happened in Turkey, and it happened all the secular trends in the Muslim majority countries and the Arab world are people who were dictators. Nasser, it started with him, Saddam Hussein, and the people who are now in charge were people speaking from a secular viewpoint and promoting, separation of authority but without democracy. So it's what we got in the West minus democratic processes. So this is, and colonialism before. So we need to get a sense in which way these parties are evolving in their terminology, and when they change and say, okay, our way of dealing with Sharia is going towards a Dawla al-Madaniyya, for example, this is a good move. Now we can think it's only strategy. But who dealing with politics doesn't consider strategy? Now you have to confront the people on the ground. Instead of putting them in jail and torturing them, this is where we have to confront them. So when it comes to this, I think that, I'm the grandson of Hassan al-Banna. So this is known, and every time I come say, okay, you as the grandson, I'm the grandson of Hassan al-Banna, but I'm not a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I have lots of issues, and I'm critical of many things, and say the evolution, the discourse, what do you mean by Sharia, how do you deal with the minority? But the only thing that I understand, that first, I'm not going to buy anything which is, this propaganda that they are the radical Islamists, because this is wrong. There is universes between Bin Laden and the Muslim Brotherhood. You can't put them in the same. And to speak about Islamofascism is not to know history. So I think that we have to be serious with history, serious with terminology, and to get a sense. Now, if you look at the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, with the revolutions and the uprisings, you understand that there are many trends. There are conflicts from within. And the first main conflict is between generations. Is the old generation is not at all following, and the young generation, they are not happy with the elder people. Why? Because, some are supporting the trend from an Islamic viewpoint that Erdogan is following. I say, this is it. This is the way. Some are saying this is post-Islamism. And some are saying, no, this is a right way to understand Islamism, which is to deal with the secular system and from within to be faithful to the principles and to go ahead. And others are very close to the literalists in Saudi Arabia. Yes, that's true, because some went there, they were trained there, and they came back. In the Muslim Brotherhood, you have a diversity. You have the leadership and you have the second generation. If you want anything to happen, let us be serious about what should be the future of a democracy. Any group, any trend that is respecting the rule of law, accepting the democratic processes before the elections and after the elections, not like the Islamic Salvation Front telling us we are going through the process as a democracy, and then when we will take over, we'll change the rules. No, after as well as before, should be involved in the political discussion. And if we are not ready for this, I think it means that we are not ready for complete democratic processes in the Muslim majority countries, because you can't do without them. We have to put them within the picture, to let them be inside. Because in fact, it's through this democratic discussion and debates that they can change and rethink some of the position. And this is the way it happens in history. Why, for example, you have seen Erdogan changing with Erbakan and coming with new thoughts? Because he was involved in the democratic open process, not in jail and not in the way the Islamists are facing or were facing. But it means for us that we need to understand that, yes, democratic processes means that we'll have people in the Muslim majority countries that are not happy with the American policy. And by the way, if we are serious about this, the people are not happy with the American policy in general. The great majority, they are not happy. They think still that the main question, which is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, is not tackled in a balanced way. There is a biased thing, and very often, and this is also what I said just after the uprisings, I wrote about that, when we got the prime ministers, the Israeli prime minister saying we have to support Mubarak because this is the way to get stability and security, because it's going to be the Iranian regime. I said, look, for the future and the long run, there will be no security and no stability for the Israeli government if you make peace with dictators. You make peace with people. So you better reassess also your policy than to support dictators in the name of your security. It's a short-run strategy. It's not going to happen in the long run. So I think that this is where today in Egypt, it's important to consider the struggles and the tensions from within the Islamists and the Islamic groups, and understanding that some are ready to go for something which is democratic processes, and others who are now trying to see how it's going to be. Are we serious about this? And still, the big question is the role of the army. Do I still have 2 minutes or 2? Okay. So, so this is, I think, something which is important. The last point, which is helping me to go to my conclusion, is while the Islamists were not leading, they were members or groups within the whole movement, we still have to understand something. And I had to write about it because very often people who didn't want to go towards this business of dictators or radical Islamists were saying, you know, look, you know what? All these people are demonstrating for the same values as ours. That's all fine. It depends now if you understand where they are coming from. Yes, they are demonstrating for justice, dignity, democracy. They all want the values that we are cherishing. But it doesn't mean that because they are cherishing the same values, they are not talking as Muslims or Coptic. So they were gathering on Fridays, Freedom Fridays, where people... So I think that the Islamic factor here is not opposed to the values that the people are cherishing. And I think that very often if either Islamists or they are like us, so we are saluting and happy with the people having the same values. But the point for me is that, yes, that's right, but we should understand that these people are coming with their background, their identity, and we don't have to say, oh, they are like us and the Islamic factor is not there. They were not Islamists, but they still are Muslims. And the Egyptian and the Tunisian and the Libyan and the Yemenite and even in Bahrain today, we are not talking too much about this and portraying this as a struggle between the Shia and the Sunni, which is wrong. It's not true. Of course, there is something which is a tension between the Shia and the Sunni, but in Bahrain, these are people that are not happy with the regime. And we also need to get this, that don't play with these, you know, factors. I would say here that we need also to understand that in the Muslim majority countries, the Islamic reference could play a very positive role if we accept from where we are that Islam is promoting also the values that we are cherishing, and it's not a counter reference. I'm not sure that we get that still in our discussion. So the only worries that I have, I still have question marks on the whole process. I'm very happy but cautiously optimistic by saying I still don't know if these revolutions are going towards the whole process. For me, they are unfinished revolutions. And I'm still waiting for the army to just step down, not to be in the process. In Egypt, they are still very much there. In Tunisia, we don't know. And in many countries, as we know now, they are very, very much involved in anything which is repression. In Yemen, in Syria, the processes are difficult. And the question for us, are we ready in the United States of America and in Europe for uncontrolled democracies? Uncontrolled democracies, because controlled democracy is a contradiction in term. I'm not sure that we are always ready for that. It means that we should be ready for people voting against our interests, but for their own interests, and interest against interest is the way we can get peace, justice, and stability everywhere in the region. Thank you.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you. Thank you for those remarks, Professor Ramadan. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment and thank Susan Thistlethwaite for her extraordinary work in pulling together this event. It's great to see all of you here. So let's get started. Hussein, can I go to you first for a response? I think listening to Tariq speak just now, he describes, I think, it seems there was this moment in Tahrir Square, this magical moment where we saw secularists and Islamists come together under a discourse. Christians too, but everybody. Within a discourse of resistance that was not focused against America or the West or Israel, but was pro-democracy, pro-freedom, pro-human rights.
Yeah.
What does it take to sustain this?
The words I'd use, I'd call it patriotic and emphasizing social consciousness. That's what was the work. It was it's sub-ideological, not post or pan, even beneath ideology, just social consciousness, a consciousness of being part of a society, and hence patriotic, but non-ideological, and with a single united demand: no Mubarak and no Mubarak's sons. A similar demand that exists in Libya right now. What it takes to sustain it is to overcome the three great threats to the ongoing successful experiments in the Arab world so far. That look more successful than the others, and that's Tunisia especially. And you're absolutely right. Tunisia is further along in every way than Egypt is. It got started quicker, but it's made much more progress. There's much more of a sense of personal freedom in Tunisia right now than there is in Egypt, where you still have serious repression going on. I mean, bloggers sentenced to prison for insulting the army. It's sort of like being sentenced to prison for insulting the king or the president or something like that. So now it's become the army, right? So the three big threats to this potential Arab awakening, uprising, spring, whatever you'd want to call it, that I've been worried about for months now, are first the potential for these dictatorships, oligarchies, autocracies to be replaced by military rule. Transition in Egypt and Tunisia is being led by military with some opposition of it, what have you. Let's see how in a few months' time, in a year's time, how much these military officers want to return to their traditional ideology of being beyond politics, and how they feel about handing over power to chaotic politicians, many of whom have self-interested and querulous and all that stuff. They might say to themselves, as many militaries have in developing states, we're the only institution capable of running this place. Sorry, we just can't trust these politicians. I mean, they're just not up to it. We can do it. We're organized, and so who knows? It's a real threat. And it doesn't have to be outright military dictatorship. It can be military rule camouflaged by, some kind of parliaments and things, but with power really residing in the hands of the military. So quasi-military rule, that's one threat. And so Egypt and Tunisia are places it could happen, especially Egypt. The second great threat is the emergence of failed states or splintered states. And the most obvious examples of that may be in the making in Libya, in which you now have two governments and two armies almost, kind of, and a division of the country. Who knows how long that will go on for? And Yemen certainly has the potential to fracture in many ways, and there are a number of other Arab states with obvious divisions that you could see in a power vacuum, failed state status or splintering. The third great threat is the one where the existing political Islamic movements come into the picture. And it goes to exactly what Professor Ramadan was talking about. The phrase in his remarks that leapt out at me most so dramatically was his phrase, true transparent democracy. Okay, now, that could mean two completely different things, depending on who hears it. I think to a lot of people in the Arab world, true transparent democracy means majority rule, as simple as that. And the inclusion of what Professor Ramadan mentioned, that it's not going to be one election only, like Fis was talking about, but that there's an understanding, a Jeffersonian understanding, that's almost universal in the Arab world now, that legitimacy of governance requires the consent of the governed, and the only way to establish that legitimacy is through elections, regular elections. Therefore, you must, the sine qua non of governance is elections. And I would say the only groups that don't get that in the present Arab political spectrum are ruling families, whether they're Republican or monarchical, in their inner cliques, or the extreme ultra-Islamists, Al-Qaeda, Salafist jihadists, who will say it's not Islamic, we should have shuras, we should have what have you, this election stuff is not good. But I mean, even in Egypt, the Salafists have now changed their mind. Now that there's an election looming, Ahmed Hassan and Ansar Sunnah are going to form a party, and they're saying, well, it's not, oh, we've been wrong for the past 50 years, it's halal. We're going to run. We're going to, so, and it does have a kind of, a positive impact on people's thinking. What may be lacking in the understanding of a lot of people, though, that provides this third threat is the flip side of the coin of democracy, the Madisonian side, if you'll allow me to put it that way in American terms. In other words, the majority has a right to rule if it gets a mandate from the electorate, but within very strong limits. In other words, the majority can't do just whatever it wants, but there have to be very strong constitutional protections for minorities, for individual citizens, for women, etc., and certain rights that are inviolable. And that without that, you end up with exactly the third threat that I'm anticipating, a tyrannous majority, which is not necessarily going to be better than a tyrannous autocratic dictatorship or a tyrannous monarchy or anything like that. It's just more broad-based, but it's not democratic. As democracy doesn't equal simply the rule of the majority. It is the rule of the majority balanced with the rights of minorities. And this, I think, requires a little bit more work in Arab political culture at the moment. So that's where Islamism, political Islam, comes into it. Because it, above all movements, because it is very popular, because it has that credibility with the people, because it is the historical alternative both to secular republics and to religious monarchies. I mean, it's not only secularism that promoted despotic rule. Monarchies that rule in the name of Islam, very, very conservative forms of Islam in the Gulf, for instance, have been also suppressive of people's rights. This might be the most obvious source of a tyrannous, unrestrained majority. So I think we need to talk a little bit about this as a potential threat. Just at the same time, we acknowledge that you might have political Islamist movements that have their origins in a non-pluralistic vision, in a vision in which their mandate ultimately is to promote virtue and suppress vice, which is not a pluralistic outlook on life, frankly, that they might be moderated by being brought into a real, true, transparent democratic system as I understand it, which I've described. And that therefore you might be able to see what we need, which is the creation of Islamist parties that are analogous to Christian democratic parties in Europe after World War II. In other words, that are conservative, that are religious, that have their base in that, but that understand the fundamental principles of pluralism and get both sides of the democratic coin. So that's sort of what I wanted to throw into the mix at this point.
Brian, if I can go to you for a minute. Going off from what Hussein said there, you've done work in a number of countries in the Middle East, Egypt, Palestine, Iraq. What does it take for the U.S.? What's the appropriate role of the U.S. policy-wise in helping strengthen the Madisonian side? And what are some of the realities, do you think, that this administration now, at this moment, might have to contend with here in the States? There's a lot of hysteria about there.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Professor Ramadan and Hussein, for coming, and Susan. This is a wonderful program, and we'll bring you into the conversation some more here. I lived and worked in the Middle East for about 5 years in the 1990s when democracy and freedom weren't part of the rhetoric of either a Republican or a Democratic administration. And I think the first thing I would say in response to your question, Matt, in this period especially, is that it's not about us. And I think that's going to be very hard for Americans and policymakers to understand, that essentially the issues of political legitimacy, the issues of leadership, the issues of defining separation of powers within societies, we can play a role to shape and influence that, but we can't determine it in any serious way. And I think this will be a very hard thing for people to understand and to flip the switch. Even while we're still in Iraq and while we're still in Afghanistan, we still, I think, have these delusions of grandeur, that we can actually orchestrate these things from the outside, whether it be through, extended security relationships with the militaries of the region, and then a sprinkling of a little bit of political development assistance. But I think first and foremost, we have to understand that these are processes that are organic, and that for them to succeed, anyone who pretends like they can come from the outside and have the right formula to create the right sorts of incentives and disincentives, simply diluting themselves in this era. And I think we need to, that is going to be, I think, a difficult thing for us to understand. The second thing is something related to what Professor Ramadan said. I'm very glad he brought up the economic dimension, because this is something that I see all of the time, whether it's in Pakistan or when I lived in Palestine and Egypt. We often sort of stovepipe our development assistance programs on political development and political party training, and then a bit of economic development. And taking into consideration what I just said before, it's not about us. We oftentimes don't understand the interlinkages between these and these societies. That the simple fact of the matter in a place like Egypt, which I know fairly well, the people who run Egypt today are the people who essentially ran Egypt since 1952. And it's not only because of their grip on political power and their ability to control the security situation, it's also the fact that you have a security establishment that runs bakeries in all of the governorates of Egypt that very much touch and have the ability to shape the motivations of people at a very ordinary level. And this, I think, even if you have a flourishing of electoral democracy, which I expect to happen in Egypt, I actually think you'll have a fairly open process, hopefully, later this year. But you could have a system that evolves that looks a lot like Pakistan today, where there's a civilian government that in name has elections, has a parliament, has a degree of open debate, but then you also have a security establishment that in essence maintains its power relationship and all of the most important issues, including a control on key sectors of the economy. And then at the same time, you have this space where you have various Islamist actors operating in a system that doesn't have that full checks and balances. And that's, I'll close on my last remark here, is that I think—
combination of my concern 1 and my concern 3.
Exactly, and I would build on it, because the phrase that, Professor, you used that really struck me was uncontrolled democracies. And I actually don't see that as such a thing, if you take into consideration the third point that Hussein was making, that in true democratic systems, there's a great deal of control. And I mean, your remarks recognize this when you talked about rule of law and the full sort of flavor of that. About 10 or 15 years ago, there was a debate about the rise of illiberal democracies. And I actually think we're on the cusp of possibly seeing that emerge in the Middle East, where you have a series of elections in a number of places, and you don't have that constitutionalism, you know, the protection for basic rights of religious minorities and freedoms of speech. And I think we have that unfolding in Iraq to a certain extent today. That if you look at the simple fact of the matter, most metrics of, if you look at the full range of liberties, political rights and civil liberties, Iraq has had fairly free and open elections. It's been fairly participatory. But you look at the fact that also hundreds of thousands of Christians have been run out of the country. There aren't basic protections for basic rights that are still there. And there's a very real threat a year after their election. I think it's, 13 months after their election. They have an incomplete national government that is not inclusive in any serious way, and a constitutional process that is 6 years still in the making, when there was a promise made 6 years ago. So all of these elements, and you know, not to beat up on you, but this notion of uncontrolled democracies, I actually think is contradictory, because you do need, for the threat of an illiberal democracy comes when you don't have the full guarantee of basic rights and civil liberties.
You know, Professor Ramadan, just on that point, liberal versus illiberal democracy, I think this comes down to, as Hussein and Brian were saying, the protection of minority rights, establishing pluralism as a central value in these new democracies. I mean, pluralism for Americans and progressives is non-negotiable. And how do you see that?
No, I think it might be a disagreement on the definitions and not on the substance. Because when I speak about uncontrolled democracy, it's exactly what you were saying, is that army behind the scene, services behind the scene, controlling the system, saying they're sending us, or even, you know, foreign forces, or Americans, for example. You know, the great question that you have now in Egypt is, what is the relationship between the Egyptian army and the states, and how is it going to play? The great question is this one, that many people are saying, the army are playing on two fields. The first is the economic field, which is they have lots of interests in many, many dimensions, from the weapons to some sectors of the Egyptian economy today. We know that the army is involved in that. And at the same time, the relationship with the states. So the perception is this controlled democracy is controlled by people who are not playing the roles. It has nothing to do with the rights. This is what I was mentioning. Is is, are we ready to go as far as to say exactly this? Rules for the majority rules, but there are rights for the minorities, and that we have to come to this. And this is where I'm saying, from my viewpoint, in this discussion, there are principles that should be put in a way which is clear and, for me, not negotiable. I'm starting with 5 principles that should be there in the way you are talking about majority and minority, is rule of law. But having said rule of law, it's not enough, because rule of law could be where do you draw these laws and what do you mean by this? Equal citizenship, it's very important, because this is the rights of the minorities, that you are Coptic and you are Muslims, you are atheists and agnostic. We don't care, same rights. So this is something which is exactly the point that is embodied in this. Yeah. The third one is universal suffrage, that it's a bottom-up negotiated authority. It's not coming from religion, it's not coming from the army, or this is what I mean by uncontrolled in this way. The fourth dimension is accountability. Because the problem that we have with many of these fake democracies is that they are democracy elected for life, and their son after them. This is what we had. This is democracies that we had there. So accountability is important. It's a mandate, and based on a clear constitutional framework. And I agree that it's important, while I think that what we have now is that we have to be cautious not to have this discussion on the constitution without getting the substance of what we are talking about. And in all the discussion of Sharia, for example, it's an important one. It's very important. What do the people mean by Sharia as the second article of the Constitution? And this is the way we can confront some of the forces. And the last is separation of power. And the last point for me is to listen to the people from Morocco to now Egypt saying, we go for something which could be a Dawla al-Madaniyya. I say, okay, what do you mean by this? What does it mean exactly as for the rights of the minorities, the women, all these forces? So I agree with this, but it means really that if we are serious about what you are saying, because I like the way you started, it's not about us. And I'm not sure that you said, I'm not sure that we get this still. I agree with you. I'm not sure that in the West we get that. And it is the starting point of a democratic process in the Middle East, in the North African countries.
Well, in my own case, I can't take that position, because while I'm an American citizen, I'm also a citizen of 2, not 1, but 2 Arab countries. So there are Arab Americans and Western Muslims and others who have a kind of a different experience, who might be able to play a role. It's not exactly an us role, but it's sort of in between role that doesn't have to be quite as hands-off as Brian was saying. In other words, there's a role here for communities in the West to play a constructive role because they have one foot in both Western societies and Middle Eastern societies, Arab societies, and particularly from my point of view, to kind of, since I think the Jeffersonian side of democracy is understood almost across the board with very few exceptions, to try to explain the other side a little bit in a little bit more detail, because I do see it lacking in a great deal of the discourse.
And if I could clarify, I'm by no means an isolationist in any way when I say it's not about us. I was mostly trying to stress the point that a lot of people in this town don't recognize that we think we can spend billions of dollars, particularly in the military assistance, and that we can then use that somehow. I mean, I've debated people on Iraq and other things who actually think that we can produce political outcomes in places like Iraq because of what we've done with security force training, which is completely simplistic. It actually abstracts from the political realities on the ground. What we do need to do differently, I think, and Susan and I have written about this together, about open source power, but understand that the nature of power in the global arena has changed fundamentally. And I think there's an understanding, too, if you look at the discourse in the national security realm here, and there's no real divide on this between conservatives or liberals or progressives, this notion of smart power, or dedicating more resources to other forms of diplomatic, economic tools, and not just simply security tools. Now, lo and behold, you look at the budget deal that was agreed to last week. You had $8 billion of cuts in foreign assistance and Millennium Challenge Corporation and other things, and an increase in defense budget. So intellectually, we understand this, that there's a need to make this shift, and I think there's a full range of expertise, as Hussein was talking about, in various communities, but it simply is not there. We need to actually develop smart power first, and then talk about it. We've been talking about smart power, and it's out there, and it exists, but it is certainly dwarfed by the fact that still in this day, we have a 14-to-1 or 12-to-1 spending disadvantage between Pentagon budget, and that's just in the government. And that doesn't even discuss what civil society and independent actors can play, or the role they can play.
I'd like to ask Professor Ramadan a question that goes to something very important that you raised, which is accurate, which is that the word secularism in the West and the word secularism in Arabic and in most Arab political is completely different. And it is tainted. It's a tainted phrase. There's no doubt. But it seems to me that without invoking the term, the fundamental principles of secularism as understood in the United States, not the French version, which tries to tell people what to wear and what not to wear and it's ridiculous ideas like that, but the American version, in which the state maintains an attitude of strict neutrality on matters of religion, is an indispensable principle. And I'm wondering if you would agree that it's indispensable to true transparent democracy to have the substance of secularism without this word and this tainted colonial history. I'm wondering your take on that.
Yes, this is what I wanted to say. You know, I wrote this in the 90s in the book Islam, the West and the Challenges of Modernity. I'm saying we have to stop talking about words and try to speak about principles and vision. I don't see any problem with what, in fact, is the very essence of secularism, which is distinguishing powers, authorities. The religious one, which is coming from on high, that you decide for yourself, and the negotiated one, which is coming from the people, and they decide for themselves. This is something which is to be promoted now with the principles that I mentioned. And then, still, there is something which is important. The principles that you are mentioning now, the separation and the process of separating. But once again, be careful, the process which is coming from the West, it's not the same. Now, you are saying something which is quite interesting. You are saying the French model is not the American model.
It is not.
And it's not. We agree with that. For me, in the Muslim majority countries, what is very important is to understand that the same principles will have different models. We can't, from where we are, impose the models while we share the principles. So this is, for me, a position of principle which is let the people in Egypt, let the people in Tunisia, but also in Saudi Arabia, because, you know, all the people are saying we don't have a problem, we have a problem with Islamists. It depends which Islamist, who. In Saudi Arabia, there are people saying democracy is against Islam, and we still deal with them in a very high level and permanent basis. My position on this is really to go for something which is separation of power coming from, but not against the Islamic principles. I don't want it to be understood as something which is coming from the West. Let the people from within share the principles and find their model, knowing here that this separation of power is not contradicting the Islamic principles.
Quick, short follow-up. Though, where you have heterogeneous societies, and every single society we're talking about is a heterogeneous one, and I don't know of a homogeneous society anywhere, but these are very heterogeneous societies we're talking about. Is it possible to have a true transparent democracy without adhering to the principle of a fairly strict neutrality on matters of religion by the state? Isn't that a sine qua non of this democracy? This is the question.
In pluralistic societies, a sine qua non principle. And this is what I'm saying. This is what
we want pluralistic societies.
Yes, this is what I want. And I think that this is the very essence of a Dawla Madaniya. If there is a meaning for a Dawla Madaniya, it's this. Now, I want the people to find their way and not for us to impose any model, because the models are historical. This is something which is important. One last point that I wanted to say about what you were saying. You know, the problem is that it's quite interesting because you were just showing the tensions that you have between the smart diplomacy and what is happening on the political ground. In the Muslim majority countries in the West, in the Middle East, in the North African country, they see this as you play with words. You sell us nice values, and on the political ground, you have completely another policy or other policies. And I think that at the end of the day, this is the big question that I have. You know, this is really the big question. Are we only here talking about the nice American values that we are, and then behind, people are saying, okay, talk. At the end of the day, the policies, they don't have anything to do with this. And I think that there is a lack of trust. We have to get it. I think that after dictatorships, if you listen to the people, they don't like the American policy in the region. They are not, and not only because of America, you know, this Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Of course, it has to do with this, but not only. They just feel that it's a great deal of hypocrisy in the way they are dealing. So the way you are portraying the tensions and the way this is happening in the Middle East, this is where I think it's about us. Yeah. It's about us here, and especially, I completely agree with what we are saying, and not only for Muslims or people having nationalities there. I think any American citizen should be involved in this. What are we saying and what are we doing?
And if I could just respond, and I know we want to broaden the conversation, I liken this, and I talk about this a lot, I liken it to an addiction, our addiction to dictators. We know that it's bad for us. We know we should stop doing this, but we just can't get out of it because, quite frankly, it's not just because there are other interests. And let's be frank, and I think President Obama, though I don't completely agree with his decisions or his speech on Libya, if you look at the text and you read it, and he talks about the clash between the interests and the values and our principles, that's a tension that any U.S. president is going to have to deal with in many different ways. Hence, you know, you'll have a different response coming from the Oval Office about Bahrain, which you wrote about in a great article this week, versus Yemen, versus Libya or Egypt. It comes in the phrase Secretary Clinton used earlier this week. There's no one-size-fits-all sort of policy. And I think this is a tension that any power, and including, you know, emerging powers in the Middle East, if they become more democratic, will have to face. They'll have their own interests too. And I don't think it's almost like life and religion and other things. It will never be fully resolved. It will have to be part of an honest dialogue where you're trying to balance all of these competing interests. And I think understanding, yes, it's not about us, but we do play an important role. I think on the other side of the equation, I think there needs to be an understanding that it isn't often about some sort of grand conspiracy or strategy to keep people down. Because one thing I often say when I speak, especially overseas, is that quite frankly, most Americans these days aren't paying attention to national security. They're paying attention to the unemployment and their own concerns here at home. And that doesn't mean we're becoming isolationist, by no means at all. But it also means that I think almost like Adam and Eve and when they bit the apple, we all can see and all have responsibilities, and we'll see our interests, and we'll have certain values that we're trying to enhance, and you'll always have to debate those.
Regional powers are susceptible to the same. I mean, the Iranian insistence on the right of the people of Bahrain to demonstrate is quite delightful. It's delicious. It's a delicious irony.
All right, I'd like to take a few questions from the audience. If we could go to the members of the press first. Let's go to Eli right here, second row. Identify yourself, please, and your...
Eli Lake, Washington Times. Dr. Ramadan, you talked about the idea, or what I thought I heard as in Dar al-Muslimiyah, of Islamists no longer seeking to replace civil law with Sharia law. So what is left, what does Islamists then do? And can you talk about the segments in the Middle East that agree with this assessment?
I think that if you listen to the Islamist discourse today, and even in the definition of Sharia, I think that there is an open door for many interpretations. So very often what we get from this word is the penal code or things like this. I think that they are widening this in a way which is some are saying, look, anything which has to do with what we are saying is that, for example, equality before law, implementing the translation of shura as being the democratic process could be something which is the Sharia. So I think that there is a discussion among Islamists, and listen to what, for example, Erdogan was saying, that there is nothing against Islam in the democratic process. This is something which has to do with our Sharia. So it's not that there is no substance to the Sharia is a redefinition of Sharia in a way which is encompassing and being in tune with some of the Western, not the Western processes, but the Western values or the perceived Western values, saying these are not Western values at the end of the day. They are as Islamic as Western values. They are shared values. And I think that we have to get that. We have to get that. And many Islamists saying the penal code is not something that we want to implement. What we want to implement is, for example, protecting family law. And you have this. Now, what does it mean? And in which way this is going to happen? Look at what happened in an interesting way from within the Islamic reference in Morocco with El Mudawana, saying, look, we are changing, reforming from within. So I think that it's not because the Dawla al-Madaniyya is something which could be separation of authority and accepting this, that they are not referring to Sharia. You have to discuss or try to get a sense of which kind of discussion they have from within about the concept of Sharia. And I would say, for example, that even in the Muslim Brotherhood today, this understanding of Sharia should be the leading word, and this is the way we are going. Many people are saying this is not the business. This is not the most important thing. The most important thing is the principles that we are struggling for. So I think that the discourse, the substance, and the principles should be also studied if you want to understand what is the current Islamist discourse on the future of the pluralistic society. And this is something that is happening now in Egypt. It happened in Turkey. It's happening in Morocco. It's happening in, anything which has, I don't know if you have seen all the discussion that we have now in Morocco. There is no uprising. But all the discussion about the Islamic reference are tremendously important.
Are you saying that there still is a goal of Sharia law, but it's interpreting Sharia law in such a way to, as you say it, encompassing equality and Western values, or what we call that?
Some trends are going in that direction, and others are not. That's quite clear. We don't have one definition of Sharia, by the way, and you have many, but some are saying the way we deal with Sharia is in that way.
Someone else? Third row, right here.
Hi, my name is Anna Masroor. I'm from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Professor Ramadan, you touched briefly earlier about the generational conflict between older and new. My question is about the youth in these countries, specifically in Egypt. I think I've heard that there's 60% who are under 31. What does that mean for the future of political Islam? Like, when these economic conditions, when their economic rights aren't immediately met, what will that mean for the future of democracy and political Islam's role there?
I'm not sure that I can tell you what does it mean. What I can see now on the ground. First, there is something which has to be analyzed, an in-depth analysis, is the change in the Islamic discourse and still the attraction of Islamist discourse towards the young people. It's still there. You cannot just say there are lots of young. Now they are entering within the movement, and they come with another understanding. They are quite connected with the world, and this is an impact of the social. That's true. They know the meaning of, they want equality, democracy, freedom, this connection, and then still they want to try to find a way, the more educated among them, trying to find a way where they can combine the two dimensions. And this is a state of tensions now. So depending on what is going to be the future, you can see something which is exactly what you said. Islamic social democracy could happen through this. Or it could be the opposite. And this is why I'm saying we can't carry on supporting dictatorships and radical regimes, because they are going to radicalize these bright people. They are not going to come to the West in an easy way because we are closing our borders. And it's going to be an explosion from within. So this process was having this coming, and be careful. There is something that it's very important, the new women's leadership. It's critical. It's really important. And not only, by the way, not only in Egypt, it's just when I went to petro monarchies and when you listen to what is happening even in Saudi Arabia, bright women, educated, and in
Yemen.
Yeah, in Yemen. That's very true. I think that this is very important. But we need to get the point. They are not acting against Islam in the name of Western values. they use Islam for the same values that we have. And if we get this, this is where we can have a very interesting dialogue for the future.
That's absolutely right. And I mean, there's no doubt the argument within the Egyptian Muslim Brothers between the older generation, the younger generation predates Tahrir Square by many years.
Yes,
There's arguments about Copts, about women. I mean, almost impressively putting them to one side a little bit to try to go forward to elections. And no, I haven't put them to one side completely. But here's the thing about young people and the vision and the optimism and all that. There's one way of understanding freedom, which is within the framework of some kind of system of belief that is based on kinds of certainty. That, in other words, that freedom is the freedom to do the right thing. That freedom is the freedom to promote virtue and to suppress vice. That is real freedom. And freedom, that's how it is expressed. But I think the danger here, and it comes back to my fear about tyrannical majorities, is that real freedom, the only freedom that really counts in the end, is the freedom to be wrong in the eyes of others. The freedom to do things that others don't approve of. The freedom to deviate from the social norm. That is where freedom is put to the test. So I think that there's, again, this word freedom is a little bit,
but
it can be nebulous.
It works as well in our Western societies. I'm not sure that we get that.
No, it works. Of course,
let us be critical everywhere. Because
absolutely. No, this is a universal problem. Yes. This is not a problem of the Arabs or the Muslims. This is a concept that applies to everywhere. Absolutely.
I'd like to go to Susan for a response to some of what was said up here. Susan, please.
I'd actually like to hone back in on women. Because women are highly religiously symbolized. And this is true in Christianity. I mean, it's not exclusive to Islam. And a lot of that has to do with family. So my antennae went up when you were talking about law, and then penal code, fine, family law. A great deal of family law involves women and women's rights. So how well do you think that is understood in relationship to the struggle for equal rights for women? Because, look at what the religious conservatives in this country have done to the concept of family. I mean, it is theocratic at this point. So in the same way, that, I think, is going to be a tough struggle. And I just wondered what you thought about that.
No, I completely agree with that. I think the perception by the way, not only in Muslim-majority countries or in North Africa, but in all the southern countries, is the resistance to the Western cultural imperialism go through the family. So we have to protect the family. This is the way we protect our societies and our cultures, and in a very reactive way. So because it's there, it's like this. It's open. It's full freedom. Even redefining the concept of family, you will have reactionary forces saying this is the... No, the point is really how do we get this discussion, constructive discussion on family law, which is opening up. And for example, I'm not fully happy with what happened in Morocco, but it's a very important first step to come with people from different forces within the society and to say, let us talk together about what we want. The problem that we have is that they talked about it, but it's not implemented. Still, it's there. It's very theoretical. It's not implemented. It's not visible. Even in Tunisia, where we were sold this idea that this is where the women are very happy, you go and you look at the rules and what is happening within the family, it's still very far from the ideal. Better, but still very far. I think that this is where we have to come from. This is a very important discussion within the civil society. This is where the critical questions should be put, and not to instrumentalize this as something which is you are truly democratic, you are going to change this, because you are dealing with tensions within the society. You need to go for structural reforms, new constitutions, more transparency, and at the same time, it has to do with, at the end of the day, there will be no democracy if there is, first, too much the army around and not education within the society. Democracies goes with education of the people to get a sense, and this is where we need to support women, for example, who are able to say, okay, I'm struggling for my rights from an Islamic viewpoint or outside the Islamic frame of reference. And they are doing the job, and we have to support this. The point is that for us, very often in the West, we still think, and this is a prejudice which is rooted in our understanding, the very moment someone is speaking from an Islamic viewpoint, it means discrimination of women. If you go for this, it's over. We can't change anything, and I think this is a shift that we need as well.
But if in a society you have, in the same society, you have women who are struggling for their rights within an Islamic framework, and also women who are struggling for their rights, as you say, outside an Islamic framework, that suggests very strongly that if you're going to have religious courts dealing with family law matters for those who want it, that if you're going to be able to preserve the second group of women's rights, you've got to have a civil law alternative for those who wish to use it. Otherwise, you're going to force women who are seeking their rights outside of an Islamic framework back into the Islamic framework, and that is not pluralism.
And it's not possible even.
Well, it is possible if they have
No, if you are serious about that, if you are, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
We have time for one more. I'd like to go back here to Sally in the green jacket.
Hi, I'm Sally Quinn from the Washington Post. Tariq, I want to go back to the Muslim Brotherhood because it's the one name that people know. It's the one thing that they can grab onto when they're looking at all of these situations in North Africa, in Egypt, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. And whether they're going to take over, whether they're not, whether they're benign, whether, what are their motivations. And, we read that they've stepped back, that they really are letting this process take place. They want to be part of it, but they don't want to take over. And yet, you also hear, I have a friend who was in Tahrir Square who said that they owned the microphones. They were letting people come to the mics, come to the stage. They were the ones who were running the show, basically, and that people who wanted to speak basically had to go through them, which sounds like that they are trying to get more control and gaining more control in a very quiet and subtle way, a way that we haven't seen before than people expect on the one hand, or that people are suspicious of on the other. I mean, what role do you think that they really are playing and will play? I mean, you did talk about how there were different opinions and how they were divided in some ways, but who's going to win?
Let me tell you. I don't know. But no, I don't think that's true. That what happened in the Liberation Square were led by the Muslim Brotherhood, that's not true.
No.
I really think that if you go through all the process, I have many friends being involved, the youth, other voices coming from all, and even the Coptic coming and being involved in the thing, this was not a Muslim Brotherhood business. I don't think so at all. Now, of course, they were, as I told you, they were trying to find a place in the whole process, and they were sometimes, and this is true, very much involved when it comes to what happened on Fridays, because it's the prayer, so they were coming with their people, but still, this was not the only voice. So I don't think that it's true to say that they were controlling from behind the scene the whole process. This is one. The second is I think that what we have today in the Muslim Brotherhood is very, very important tensions between people saying, okay, let us go for a political party, we leave the Muslim Brotherhood behind, and others saying, no, we have to go through something which is alliances with other forces. So all this discussion are here, and even the relationship, all the discussion, they had discussion about the concept of Sharia. What do you mean about women being involved? What is our relationship with Coptic people, and in which way? All this is there. So I think that they are dealing with the reality and trying to find their place. Now, if we look at which kind of force, I said it before, I think 20 to 30% of the opposition force could be attracted by the Muslim Brotherhood for many reasons, but it's not going to be the majority. Are they going to play a role in the future if we go for a democratic process? Yes. So now the most important point for me is, do we have to deal with them, to confront their views, They are part of the democratic process. I say yes if we are consistent with our values. Now, to start and to carry on this demonization of the Muslim Brotherhood and all the Islamists will help nobody except the more radicals that are saying, look, you are open and at the end of the day you will get exactly the same. So we have to be serious about that. It's a very critical issue, is that for many people, you know, let me tell you something, that it's something that I'm experiencing in my daily life, trying to be open to the people and trying to say, look what they are doing with you. It means they don't care. Open or not, at the end of the day, Islam is a problem. So we better go for more radical views, because you get the point, is that for us it's also to understand that now if we want to deal with democracies in the North African countries and the Middle East, we need to talk to people who are not going to share some of our vision of the world, our interest. We need to deal with them. And the Muslim Brotherhood are part of them. And their views, for example, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we need to deal with people telling you, you are wrong. You are not following the right policy when it comes to the peace process in there. So I think that this is something that I don't see enough in the States, and this is why I think as citizens, as intellectuals, as advisors, as journalists, these are voices that should be heard here. That we need to get the sense that we need to be very pluralistic in our way to deal with our fellow partners over there, and also not to think only about interest or interest-wise policies. I think that this is not going to continue like that. This is my position. At least on this issue, I think that we need now to open up.
Can I say very, very quickly, I've been sitting here emphasizing, you know, the restraint on the majority rule. But I agree with you. Robert Satloff's formulation of discriminate democracy for everybody, but Islam is not democracy at all. There's going to be a religious right. There's a religious right here. There's a religious right in Israel. There'll be religious right in all of these emerging Arab and Islamic democracies. And they have to have a role to play within the rule of law, but the rule of law with the understanding that
the rights of the minority.
The rights and individuals, yeah. That's it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Ramadan, and thank you to the panelists, and thank you all.